Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Alex Krainer. Alex is a former hedge fund manager, a market analyst, an author, and a geopolitical analyst based in Europe. Alex, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for the invite, Jyotish, and always good to join you.
I wanted to start by having your thoughts about how you would conceptualize this much discussed idea or fact about the decline of the West. What are some of the conceptual parameters, or what are some of the areas that come to your mind when one talks about the decline of the West? Because over the year or so, we have seen a massive Western defeat. We are talking about NATO's defeat in Ukraine against Russia. We have seen the Western economic superpowers defeat against a rising power. I'm talking about the US defeat in the self-imposed trade war or economic warfare against China. And we have seen the defeat of the legacy media or the whole propaganda system, particularly in the case of Palestine, which they tried their best to cover up, but we have seen that they have failed. And finally, there has been a long-term decline of economic growth, particularly striking in Europe, but also to a great extent in the United States, if we take away 1/3 of the growth that is contributed by non-economic activities, effectively the whole speculative finance, if you like, coupled with massive inequality. How would you define the decline of the West?
The key determining factor that is the cause of the West decline is in our monetary systems. That is the core principle, and from there, the poison flows to all other relationships in society. So this has been with us for centuries. And basically what I'm talking about is that our economic systems basically are underpinned on the system of credit based on fraudulent money. So all the money that goes into the system is privately issued out of thin air. Only the principal goes into circulation, and it has to be repaid with interest. So effectively, you put a certain amount of money into circulation, but maybe more than that needs to be repaid. Money that simply doesn't exist. Like if I borrow, let's say, $100,000 to buy a house, over the life of the mortgage, I will probably have to pay back $200,000. The other $100,000 never goes into circulation, and the only way I can pay 200 is I have to earn it from other participants in the economy. And in order to do that, they have to get into debt, so that more money goes into circulation so that I could earn it from there. Effectively, you have a Ponzi scheme. And that means that the system is only stable insofar as it grows. As soon as it stops growing, it's baked in that it will start to implode on itself. And now that gives you very few choices. One of the choices is that you start generating credit you start lowering the credit standards. So, you say, well, we see that happening in the United Kingdom today, that, the Bank of England is loosening the leverage levels and the collateral standards that You can accept any kind of toxic junk as good collateral to issue more loans because they have to flood the system with liquidity in order to keep it from collapsing. And so that takes you to the unraveling that has been typical for all economic systems that have applied this monetary system. So we've seen that in Argentina and Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and in Germany during the Weimar Republic, and many places. There's been dozens of examples of hyperinflationary unraveling around the world during the 20th century, all in the market-oriented economies, right? Well, most of them in the market-oriented economies. Your other choice is you have to somehow bring new wealth into the system. So that can happen endogenously. So if you find a large oil find, well, then that's good collateral against which you can then uh, create a new credit impulse and refloat the system for a time. A business cycle basically, or a gold find, or maybe some new technological breakthrough that um, substantially increases the system's productivity. But if you're like if you're finding no new resources, if your productivity has leveled off and the debt levels continue to grow and they always outgrow the GDP, then, oh yeah, before I go there, I just wanted to, for your readers, you can actually visualize what I'm talking about, because if you go to the FRED website, Federal Reserve Education, I don't know what it is, directory, or FRED, right? You can pull up two time series. One of them is the monetary base, right? The amount of currency in circulation in the US economy. And the other one is total credit market debt, which means it includes the public debts, the government debts, and the private, corporate and personal debts, and financial debts that are in the system. So what you get is two curves. One of them, let's say, goes like this. That's the monetary base. And then the second one, it looks like this. That's the total credit market debt, which shows you that over very long stretches of time, the debt in the system grows at a much faster rate than the total of money available to pay that debt. And so I think last time I looked a few months ago, the total monetary base in the United States was something around $6 trillion, maybe 6.5. And the total credit market debt was close to 120 trillion. So it means that there's more than 6 times as much debt in the system than there is money with which to pay it back. So
6 or
that's
20?
yes.
20 times,
Sorry?
isn't it? 120 and
No,
6.
yeah, sorry, yes, almost 20 times. Yeah, so I skipped class when they were teaching that in math. But so that's the definition of unsustainable. And so if you live in a system where the banking establishment dominates the society, then they will be very tempted to take wealth from elsewhere. So you will get colonialism. They will start. Oh, look, the Middle East has lots of oil, so we'll take that. And that's the history of Western colonialism that you get then, and that creates these. What I mean to say is that system then is where the poisons flow into every other relationship in society. It generates militarism, it generates colonialism, foreign conquest, imperialism, heavy-handed exploitation of local populations abroad but also increasingly heavy-handed exploitation of the domestic population. So you will always see that throughout history, and this is happening for centuries, that these systems basically create uh, mayhem abroad and misery at home. You know, things that Charles Dickens has described in his novels about, life of ordinary people in England, and Upton Sinclair described the same for the United States. This is typical, and we see the same symptoms of decline now multiply in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, all of these developed Western countries, because the gravy train of colonizing and plundering the rest of the world has now, it hasn't stopped, but it has clogged, it became clogged up. The French have lost their African colonies. The British are being pushed out of various parts of the world. The United States is at a crossroads where it has to decide who they want to be in the future. Do they want to be an imperial power, or do they want to be an industrial power? But I think that these are the systemic causes behind the decline of the West. And so as you start to drain the substance, then you no longer have resources to invest into infrastructure, and you no longer have resources to invest into your militaries. So even the military strength is atrophying. Well, they knew that, they anticipated that, which is why empires always end up reaching out for proxy armies. you know uh, Barbarian hordes, or maybe you cultivate radical Islamist terrorist groups everywhere around the world, and then you send them to destabilize Nigeria, and to destabilize Tanzania, and to destabilize Sudan, and to attack Russia in Dagestan and Chechnya, and on and on. But even that, I think, at some point it runs out, and if the system persists in its in the path defined by this inertia, that the outcome is then the same as the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, where in the end it's a total devastation of everything. You lose markets, you lose economies. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, even money disappeared for a few centuries. There was no money. You had local communities kind of devolved to just self-sustenance. They had to be completely self-sustaining, because even markets for cheap, simple goods like horseshoes and nails and roof tiles completely disappeared. Everything had to be um, provided within the community. So that means you're basically going back to the Copper Age. You're going back to native living, and left to itself, the system goes in that direction. Now, I have to say, I'm very hopeful that today an alternative has emerged in the East. With the rise of India and China, and Russia as well, and Iran, and the BRICS movements. That an alternative is emerging, where countries will be able to kick out their political elites, and to say, no, we need a new path forward. In fact, we will consider joining the BRICS movement, the Belt and Road Initiative, the new systems of trade settlement and trade finance, and new payment systems. And so, we're moving away from the Eurocentric world into an alternative, but that alternative may ultimately become available to Western nations, so that when they pass a certain, let's call it a cathartic crisis, where they're going to have to um, ponder their identity, they will be able to join the rest of the world, uh, not as a master and a dictator, but as a polite guest at the global banquet.
And if you could tell us about how Europe is looking at this moment, particularly its relationship with the United States, given what you just described as the massive explosion of credit. I mean, in in so many ways, the explosion of credit is built into the history of capitalism, and I couldn't help but notice you said hundreds of years, and that's true, and that there are these cycles of accumulation, as Arigi explains, where the finance becomes heavier than the productive sphere. But sticking to the recent history, we saw the post-90s phase as this massive explosion of financial activities and credit. And there, Europe became much more subservient to the United States right from the beginning of the 90s, and European growth also slowed down. And as its bankers and other financial managers got much more tightly integrated into the transatlantic financial system, it was already taking up much of the beating, because part of that explosion of credit and financial system was also offshoring production into the global south, because as you said, you need a material basis at least to underpin to some extent that explosion of the financial activity, including credit. And part of that strategy was to extract cheap labor from the global south. And we'd come to China and the global south in a while. But that meant that European and American production was falling behind. And more recently, we have seen that Chinese players and production, I mean, to some extent, initially they benefited. Germany, for instance, was exporting a lot of intermediate materials to China as it rose, but eventually China started eating up its own market, the German markets in the auto sectors and so on and so forth, leading to a total loss for Europe, because on one hand, their financial sphere, apart from probably London, who plays a brokerage role to New York, they are completely subservient to New York. On the other hand, they are losing big time in the material realm, both to China and the global south, and also as the US has unleashed its tributary extraction, it is losing to the United States itself. Under these conditions, what do you think is the strategy of the European elites to cope up with this crisis?
The strategy of European elites is war. It's war. It's really simple. But I want to go back to something you said, because I think we have to be very careful. You know, I don't think it's a question of capitalism. I don't think it's even a matter of left versus right. It's really a matter of fraud, because the monetary system that we have is fraudulent. Uh, but it's not just fraudulent on the right side. It's fraudulent everywhere. I grew up in the communist world, right? I grew up in former Yugoslavia. We had a socialist system with a one-party communist regime, but we had the same monetary system and all the same symptoms of decline in society emerged in the late 70s and 80s, uh, the same as they are now in the West. And so we ended up with hyperinflation and war. And so today, Europe is moving into a space of higher inflation. The numbers they report are another lie, because the cost of living crisis is very acute in Europe, in places like Germany, France, Great Britain. You know, people are really struggling. They're struggling to meet their bills. Compared to the way life was 20, 30 years ago, it's radically worse. I see hundreds of reports in social media where people say, how can this be? You know, I make more money than I did 20 years ago, but 20 years ago I felt comfortable. Today I'm ridden with anxiety because I can't arrive to the end of my bills. So what happens then, you get social pressures, you get risk of social revolts, potentially revolutions and civil wars because people say enough. It's not that the economy doesn't work. The economy does work. The economy is still productive because, the land still grows wheat and rice and potatoes, and chickens still grow and cows still grow and they still give milk. All of that is there. Mechanics can still fix cars, and bakers still bake breads, and dentists still do their thing. Let's say the productive capacities of an economy are there, they're intact, they work. It's the means of exchange that dry up. So, if a baker can't pay for the shipment of wheat, then the farmer will stop delivering the wheat and the baker will close down and go bankrupt, not because people don't need bread or there's no wheat or the baker doesn't know how to bake bread anymore. It's because the money grinds down to a halt. That's the problem in all cases. So when this starts to happen, there's a risk of social revolt. And then the people who are at the top echelon of a society, the people who are in power, they reckon, okay, so we might end up with a revolution on our hand, and we might all get guillotined in the public square. So we need an external enemy. So they start saying the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. This is what's happening in Europe. And so what happens then is that you take fighting age males, military age males, which are probably the biggest source of risk for you, and you ship them off to a foreign battlefield where the idea is to sacrifice them in large numbers so that they are no longer a risk to you. And at the same time, you create conditions in which you can deal with all oppositions in a very radical way. Because, like if you're engaged in a foreign war, anybody who criticizes the government can be put away because they can accuse you of being unpatriotic. They can accuse you of being aiding and abetting the enemy, of being a Russian agent or something like this. So they can clean up their opposition. They can justify everything by the foreign war. If there's no more food in supermarkets, or there's no medicines in pharmacies, and you can't get an appointment with your doctor, and you're not receiving your pension, you're not receiving your salary, well, they can all say like, well, it's a shared sacrifice, we have to defend our nation, and everything is the Russians' fault. And so they kind of deflect the blame from themselves to the foreign enemy. And then after the big war, they get a blank slate. They get a clean slate, and they say, oh, now we need to rebuild the country. And so we will provide credits for reconstruction and development. And then they put the surviving population back to work. The credit cycle starts from scratch, and they perpetuate their dominance over society for another cycle of history. And so that's, I think, basically what their strategy is at the moment. Try in every way possible to provoke a war against Russia.
I want to come back to Russia, but just a brief comment on your analogy of the crisis of the 1970s in Yugoslavia and what we are seeing now. My understanding is that the root of that crisis was centered on Western banks, because Yugoslavia starting with 1970s, started to borrow massively from Western banks. And when the interest rates were lower, that kind of was working in some ways, although it was still creating inflation. But with the Volcker shock, interest rates rose, and with the kind of massive dollar liabilities that Yugoslavia was having because of oil, the oil crisis also heightened it. Then there were other set of problems, of course, given there were investment imbalances, given the work units were worker managed. And yes, these arguments have been in within the Soviet Union, inside China, how much should go into consumption, how much should go into heavy industries, and so on. And when the workers' enterprises control these decisions about investment, then you can end up creating these imbalances. And in Yugoslavia, one of the massive flaws was that World Bank was becoming very dominant in its policy instruction of decentralizing, and that's where we get a lot of this imbalance to begin with. So I'm not sure we see the centrality. Maybe our objective analysis is similar, but I'm not sure you and I see the centrality of the overall system as in the same line.
No, if I understand what you said correctly, Jyotish, I think that we're talking about the exact same thing. It manifests itself in different ways under different systems. There's no question that there are certain fundamental differences between the socialist system and the capitalist system, or at least, the way what we label as the socialist system and the capitalist system. But at the end, the monetary system is where the seeds of collapse are baked in from the get-go. Before a single unit of currency goes into circulation, the collapse is baked in. It's only a question of time. So yes, it was the foreign banks that kind of pushed the system into collapse, because yes, like we raised a lot of credit abroad, and then came the Volcker shock, and then interest rates suddenly exploded, and the country was no longer viable. That is, we had to borrow money with which to pay the money. But basically, you get that with foreign banks or without foreign banks, because you're always operating with this fractional reserve fiat currency system, and that problem is going to manifest itself always. Mainly the overhang of unpayable debts.
But the scale, I suppose, would be different, because under a socialist system, you have more or less the central banks deciding on the quantum of money or the credit to be created. And sure, I agree that you can still create a lot more credit because your steel industries might be politically very powerful and can tell you to direct a lot of investment, and part of those investments would be fictitious investment, particularly if you can't ramp up the production and productivity to that scale. But what we have seen in under the capitalist core is the rise of the private players who are creating much of the money. I mean, the central bank is kind of who does the job, but the demand of that credit comes from the private players, isn't it? The money manager, the asset fund manager, the rise of these massive
Yes.
institutions in
Yes.
the 1990s.
Yes. Okay. So if we have to draw a distinction between this, what we call the socialist system and the capitalist system, I think this is an important distinction. I would propose the following. So in both systems, you have this growth of debt, which always outstrips the growth of productivity and the growth of the currency in circulation. And what you get always, then there's another problem with the same problem, but a different category, is the problem that the money you put into circulation is always the principal. You have to repay it with interest. Then from there you get another problem that is basically, let's take a concept of the GDP. Basically, what you have is that in any given period of time, the system produces so many goods and services, and we measure them by price. We say the GDP is so many dollars, so many rupees, so many euros, and so forth. And that presupposes that all the goods and services are sold at list prices. But this never works out for two reasons. You have two big drains of liquidity from the system. One of them are savings, because all the whole output of an economic system is the price of its products and services. But that same amount is also the income of people who produce it, right? and represents the purchasing power available to absorb the product, right? So, let's pretend that there's no imports and exports, right? Now, if people save a chunk of their income, let's say they save 5%, well, that means that the whole output would not be able to be absorbed. So that means that the producers, the entrepreneurs, are either going to have to lower their prices, or they're going to have to just like destroy part of the production. That creates the so-called deflationary gap, which is the gap between the total output and the total purchasing power that's available. So savings, another big drain on the system, because of the nature of the monetary system, is that every time any participant pays back their debt, that amount of money disappears from circulation, right? Because by paying back your debt, you remove that amount of currency from circulation. So you have those two big drains, which always make it that the available purchasing power in a system is never sufficient to absorb the system's output. Okay. Now, the only way you can bridge that gap is for the government to step in as a participant. And it's not enough to tax and spend, because you're just shifting the same purchasing power from private hands to the public hands. The government actually has to get into debt to bridge the deflationary gap. So if you look at all countries in the world, socialist and capitalist, you will see that the budget deficits always have these tendencies, and the quantity of debt in the system always grows, and always faster than the output. So the government, the difference between the capitalist and socialist systems is the way the government enters as a participant. And so in what we call socialist system, most of the government spending goes bottom up, meaning people get generous benefits with their employment. They get relatively more generous salaries, pensions. Public workers have good salaries. Governments invest in healthcare, education, public spaces, safety, and so on. The effect of that is that investment and spending decisions are made bottom up, meaning people have money to spend in shops, in restaurants, on trips, tourism, travel, cars, houses, furniture, stuff like that. In what we call capitalist system, government largesse flows top down, which means that the governments give large amounts of money to big pharma, big oil, military industrial complex, big agriculture, and so on. And the problem with that is that you're empowering corporate players, and then corporate players become political participants, because they now, they define employment, they define spending. Some of that money goes back through lobbying to the political representatives, and then, by funding big military industrial complex, you're even seeding the seeds of fascism. Okay, so at the level of money and economy, the principle is the same, but the behavior of the two systems is different, in that in one you get bottom up activity, the other one you get top down activity. So usually socialist system haven't been militarily aggressive, and you didn't have as bad polarization of wealth in society. In what we call capitalist system, you have increasing polarization of wealth, and you have very often emergence of fascism and militarism and war and conquest and so on. So that I think is very important to distinguish that as different between two systems, but both systems have the same problem and similar symptoms in using the same type of money. And I think that whether you lean towards socialism or whether you lean towards capitalism, both systems have to address that problem, because it makes either system unsustainable. And we see capitalist systems in decomposition today, but the whole socialist world collapsed, in the 90s as well. Neither one is sustainable.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with you, Alex, on the central point that when one looks at the economy as a whole on the aggregate level, there are many contradictions that emerge on both socialist systems and capitalist systems. I also have the similar conclusion like yours that some of the functions are managed very differently. But I'm curious about your final conclusion that uh, if both systems are equally bad, then what's the alternative?
Oh, no, 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 Jyotish. I'm not saying that both systems are equally bad. I'm saying that both systems have the same problem that they need to address because it renders them unsustainable. I I do think that the socialist approach is better. And the reason why I think that, and like I'm a former hedge fund manager. I have a lot of friends who are millionaires and businessmen, and they tend to have these hardcore uh, conservative views where they hate socialism and they think capitalism is the right way. And I always tell them, okay, so even if you're an entrepreneur and you're a cold-hearted capitalist, what does that mean? That means that you want to be a business owner, right? You want to be an entrepreneur. If you're a business owner, are you better off when people in your community have spending power? Or are you better off if you have homeless people lying around the street where your sons and daughters have to walk to school to? What's better? So, I mean, is it better that if we already come to peace with the fact that with time, governments account for a larger and larger and larger chunk of the GDP? That's practically everywhere. Um, People never complain if the government gives money to large agricultural corporations and military industrial complex, because they can always say, like, foreign threats, the Chinese are coming, the Russians are coming, and nobody complains. If they give money to big oil, if they give money to big pharma because public health emergencies, blah blah, they never complain. But they complain bitterly if, like, a woman who has 5 children gets money from the government and she didn't deserve it. And I think, why? Because if that woman, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you own a restaurant. If that woman has money, she will be your customer. If she has no money, she ends up on the street, and she will end up a burden to you because somehow you're going to have to take care of her and her children. And so I do think that the bottom up approach is better because it creates better social cohesion, a more diverse economy. It creates a more diverse market for entrepreneurs, because even if you have inflation, even if you have an unsustainable system, if ordinary people have money to spend, then you can start a business, you can have a restaurant, you can have a travel agency, you can like you can do a lot of things. If people are completely broke, like in Victorian England, like in Upton Sinclair's United States, like in the Western Roman Empire, in Italy during the Lombard banking system, then all you have is war. All you have is war, because the only way the only place you're going to find new wealth is going to be in foreign countries. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the road to perdition.
I'm glad you clarify, because I think part of my misunderstanding was based on your choice of word about both are unsustainable. Because what I read is that it, I read the word unsustainable as if the unraveling is inevitable. But from your clarification, what I read is that what you mean is that both systems have contradictions which need to be managed as long as
Yes,
they want to
that's correct. That is
move
correct.
forward. Yeah,
Yes.
not
Yeah.
necessarily
That's what I'm
unstable in
trying
the
to say.
sense.
I've wrote a number of articles about this, and like when you write an article, you can choose your words carefully and correct things. But like when you speak off the top of your head, then sometimes it's harder to convey the meaning exactly, because we're dealing with something relatively complex and something that they never taught us in school. Like I studied economics in school, and I took it very seriously. I really did try to learn and understand. But this concept of the deflationary gap, that was never mentioned in any of my textbooks. Never, ever, ever. The first time I came across that concept was when I read Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, which was maybe 15, 20 years ago. But when I went to the university, and I have my university textbooks, and I looked at it's not even mentioned.
What
And it's
about Keynes' general theory? Because I understand what you are saying about this deflationary gap as Keynes's overall idea about fall of effective demand. Because when he was trying to explain that for investment to keep moving at that speed or keep coming, the moment business sentiments dries down, you have this collapse of the effective demand. That's effectively, as I understood, your concept of deflationary gap, isn't it?
yes, that is correct, but I don't think that Keynes explained it quite correctly. You know, the correct explanation is he doesn't mention deflationary gap.
Right.
He does describe it in a different way, and that description is on the right track, but it's not. My personal belief, Jyotish, is that Keynes worked for the establishment that in Britain, which basically ambushed the world with this monetary system.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not ambushed. It came from it existed long before them, but which kind of forced this monetary system on all the rest of the world. And today, if you want to try a different monetary system, you're going to find yourself under sanctions, and you're going to be cut off from the world trade. So everybody has to accept this, because ultimately it benefits the Western financial banking cartels, which are present pretty much everywhere around the world.
I
And
I'm aware you need to go, and
yeah,
so
just to finish very quickly, um, Keynes was in these people's employment. He was part of that establishment. So I think that like if you read his earliest works, you see that he understands the problem matter. But in every next book or essay he writes, he kind of dilutes the diagnose of the problem to where it becomes almost undiscernible. And by the time he wrote the general theory, you could cut it a thousand ways and not really get what the problem is. But in his earliest writings, you can see that he exactly understood what the problem was. And it is the deflationary gap. I think he never called it deflationary gap, but it is this general fall in aggregate demand, which then has to be made up by the government. So anyway, let's finish it there for now, Jyotish. Thank you.
Yes, we'll leave it there. This was a fascinating conversation. Didn't go the way I planned to, but I'm so glad that it happened. And I am not glad that we had to end it halfway. We definitely need to have a part two, because I think some of the things you said towards the end, it would have been so much interesting if we could discuss China, because how the central banks manage a massive amount of credit creation there. In fact, if you look at China from the 1990s, the credit creation in China was spectacular. In my recent research, I calculated a credit creation index for China compared to that of India, and it was many times higher. And yet, China also has a very high savings rate, and it had those central banks and government have those same kind of contradictions that you spoke about, whether it to manage the deflationary gap along with not creating an inflation. So basically, balance between deflation and investment, balance between consumption to some extent and investment. Of course, you can argue that China has the luxury of the external market, so it could somewhat press consumption as a percentage of its overall investment. But I think it would have been very interesting to follow up along those directions about which system is better able, if we are to think about an alternative, because also credit creation is not same as indebtedness, and that's what I think the Chinese economy says. I mean, indebtedness is practically zero, while amount of credit created has been enormous, and that has been backed by, underpinned by enormous rise in productivity increase. And I do think for the rest of us, if we are to think about better futures for all of us, we need to drill down on these differences. But I'm sorry for overstepping 4 minutes. I wanted to share these comments to make way for a round two discussion of this. Last thoughts on you, and we'll end it
Can
there.
I ask a favor?
Yes.
If you wrote an article about this Chinese credit impulse, if you could please share it, I would very much be interested in reading it, and I will send you a link to an article in which I explained what we just discussed, probably in a more articulate way than I was able to do verbally like this today. And
Absolutely.
then, you know, what you say, I think, is a very important and interesting discussion, and we should definitely take it up at some point in the near future.
Thank you so much, Alec. This was a fascinating
Great pleasure.
conversation. Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much for your
having me.
time. Take care.
And again, greetings to all your viewers and listeners.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.